Arguably, the biggest challenge we face in how to be moral people isn't in making choices between good and evil, because that's easy, but in making choices between lesser and greater goods. We all know we shouldn't make evil choices or compromises on good ones, but when it comes to two choices that are good in and of themselves, how do we know which is the better good that we ought to choose? So for example, something like physical fitness, which is a virtue that you can't really fault someone who devotes time to, staying in shape through disciplined habit and exercise. But what if that routine comes into tension or even conflict with other obligations, like if you're married, spending time with your spouse and your children? What if you have to choose to sacrifice either a certain caliber of fitness or time that you could spend bonding with and mentoring and leading your family? Obviously, a line has to be drawn somewhere, but where that line is drawn isn't always obvious. We can all admit that honesty is important and that deception is hardly ever justified, if at all. But what if you're called to offer your honest opinion that could potentially injure someone, if spoken bluntly? Does your kindness outweigh your commitment to honesty? What if some superior to whom you owe obedience is abusing their authority or asks something of you that would place your obedience against some other virtue like justice or prudence? Does obedience win out over those other goods? We face dilemmas like this all the time and too easily disregard the severity of getting it wrong when we choose between these two or multiple good options. Think of someone like an architect who prioritizes aesthetics above everything else. Everything about the design of his buildings is subordinated to their appearance. So while the proportions are striking and the ornaments that he adds to things like windows and doors, they're just sublime. If he doesn't pay enough attention to the sound structural requirements, the whole thing may become unsustainable, rendering the aesthetics kind of pointless since they only derive their existence from a structure that can remain erect. All of which reveals a principle, which is that anything not properly ordered becomes disordered. If you don't have a sound appreciation for how some goods are more or less important than other goods, then you're going to give the wrong ones priority over others that deserve that priority. And as a result, the effects will be disordered. And this is especially true of our lives. If we habitually get this wrong, if we habitually give priority to choices or goals that may be good, but aren't as good or important as others we might be neglecting, our lives and our character become disordered. Okay, so why am I talking about this? I'd say because it describes a massive problem in the church today. If the church is going to be vibrant, if it's going to be capable of performing its mission, which is no easy mission, then it needs to be well ordered, like any system. If the church is a body or a composition of believers, then those parts and activities need to be well ordered. And if they're not, well, then it becomes disordered. And disorder will reveal itself in the effects. And right now, we need to be more honest about the effects that are manifest in the church today. There's a critical shortage of priests for one. So in Canada, where I live, there is little more than 6,000 priests or so in ministry. In order to sustain those numbers, not grow as would be required for a growing population, but just to sustain those numbers, we would need something like 2,200 seminarians currently in formation. Because based on the length of the career for your average priest, with the number we have, we can expect about 150 priests who retire or die each year. And because only about 50% of seminarians make it through to ordination, we need to double that number entering each year into the seminary, which means that given the 7 to 8 year formation length, we should have about 2,200 seminarians at any given time. But in Canada, we currently have 600, or at least those are the estimates that I've seen. That's about a quarter of what we need just to sustain our currently extremely low number, which means the 600 we have is catastrophically low. It means that the church as we know it is headed over a demographic cliff. If something doesn't change drastically and urgently, that means that in 40 years, the whole country will have 800 priests, which is entirely unsustainable. And yet, if you talk to administrators and even bishops, like the alarm bells don't seem to be going off. In fact, no church institution in Canada has made researching these numbers a priority. You'll hear bishops say, we need to focus on vocations. We need to pray for vocations. But a systematic approach or even overhaul or evaluation of the situation seems to be completely absent from their list of priorities. And if you ask me, having priests seems like That should be a pretty big priority. Obviously, without them, you don't have a church, just like the architect who doesn't have a building because he neglected sound structural engineering because he was too focused on aesthetics. And the vocations thing, that's just one example. We could talk about how numbers from estimates I've seen of 80 to 90% of youth raised in the church end up leaving into adulthood. We could talk about the tragic lack of confidence Catholics have in the church's most fundamental teachings. We could talk about the complete collapse of religious orders. Any sane person who honestly looks at the landscape of the institutional church today in countries like Canada would have to admit something is fundamentally broken. Something has become disordered. And it likely isn't the difference between choosing obvious evils over obvious goods, although maybe that is going on as well. It's more likely that we've gotten competing goods out of order. And when I think about it, there's a couple that seem obvious to me that are worth highlighting. The first is dialogue with the world and other faith traditions, or what we now call ecumenism. And if the aim of ecumenism is actual unity, then this is obviously and unavoidably a good thing. But in practice, from what I've seen, the aims of ecumenism and dialogue are to affirm in friendship the beliefs and traditions of other people. It means hosting events where delegates get together in the spirit of friendship, or even create pseudo-liturgical celebrations that they can then perform together. But if true unity is the aim, the only way you can find that is in common creed and culture. In other words, you have to agree on what true orthodoxy is. But that would require a kind of honesty and willingness to have uncomfortable conversations that the ecumenical movement doesn't really seem to be willing to have. It would require an accurate assessment of our differences and a willingness to define errors that can't be accepted in a unified church. Otherwise, any unity that we might achieve would be superficial and nominal at best, and therefore not really worth having. And not only are they not having those conversations, but in the name of dialogue and friendship, the Catholic Church has been willing to sacrifice its own unique character and the greatest treasures of its tradition to try to bridge the gap and downplay differences that exist between various communities. This was a big motivation behind the liturgical changes of the 1960s. And even if you don't think that was the motivation, it certainly was the effect. It's no coincidence that the new Mass has a much more dramatic resemblance to mainline Protestant liturgies like Anglicans and Lutherans than the old Latin Mass ever did. So what we've seen is the goal of friendship and dialogue with non-Catholics take a higher position among the priorities of the Church than our sacred forms of worship, which have sustained the Church for millennia, as seen by the fact that they now more closely resemble traditions that were instituted by people like Henry VIII, Thomas Cranmer, John Calvin, and Martin Luther, people who hated the Catholic Church. This in spite of the fact that Pope St. Pius X said that the liturgy is the first and most indispensable font by which the Christian spirit flourishes. This in spite of the fact that Pope Pius XII said the Mass is the chief expression of the Church's inner life and the primary source of the divine life communicated to us. This in spite of the fact that Vatican II said the liturgy is the highest activity of the Church and the source from which all her power flows. You will never hear ecumenism described this way by any teaching of the Church with any serious doctrinal weight. And yet, the liturgy was the thing we sacrificed. We rearranged, we broke apart and pieced back together according to the whims of a committee so as to render the aims of ecumenism more attainable. On the face of it, that seems to be a disorder of priorities, which can only result in disordered effects. The other misplaced priority is in the way that the contemporary hierarchy emphasizes our obligations to the corporal works of mercy, and especially loving the poor, while I would say undervaluing the role that supernatural faith plays in inspiring people to want to love the poor. Now, neither of those things should be neglected. They are both essential ingredients of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. But for whatever reason, in the 20th century, the Church seemed to split into two polarized factions committed to one of these two dimensions of the Church's life. On the social justice side, you had more left-leaning Catholics, a lot of whom were influenced by modernism, who believed that the Church's sole priority was development and relief services, and who downplayed the supernatural dimensions of the faith. And then on the other side, you had the charismatic movement, which emphasized, to the exclusion of almost all else, the supernatural dimensions of the Church's character. And for people of actual faith who really believed that Jesus was, true God from true God, and that he resurrected from the dead, the charismatic movement was one of the only places of refuge for people of true faith in the Church. This false dichotomy shows a lack of appreciation for what faith, hope, and love are as supernatural virtues and how they relate to each other. You don't get one without the others, because the reason we call them supernatural is because none of them make sense to us apart from God's revelation about himself and about his plan of salvation for us. They aren't natural virtues, which means that reason doesn't inform our understanding of them. There's no good reason to have faith that God will save you unless he first reveals that this is his plan. There's no reason to have confidence that he will keep to his promises in hope unless he makes those promises. And there's no reason to love him or the most vulnerable among us unless he teaches us that this is what we ought to do to align ourselves with his nature. Otherwise, there's no logical reason to love the poor. They can't return that love in proportion. Most aren't going to be permanently lifted out of their poverty by that love. Jesus said that we will always have the poor with us, and doing so will only ever amount to self-sacrifice. And again, reason doesn't tell us there's good reason to sacrifice yourself. Why should the strong be made weaker through their sacrifices for the weak who aren't made any stronger for it? It just doesn't follow naturally, but it does follow supernaturally. If God, through his son, tells us that he identifies with the poor, the helpless, the widow, the orphan, and that by loving them, you then in turn love him. If he tells us that his nature is self-giving love, which we are then to imitate, then loving those who can't benefit you in any way becomes the highest expression of that kind of love. But that kind of love requires faith. You will never motivate people to be willing to make those kinds of sacrifices if they aren't first deeply in love with Christ. But faith isn't something that can be taken for granted. It needs to be encouraged. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be inspired by encounters with the living God that are consistent with his magnificence and his glory. You will never be able to extract authentic love for the poor out of a church that lacks faith in Christ and his teachings, or a church that doesn't first have the supernatural virtue of faith. Just look at the episode with Julian the Apostate. He was a Christian who became the Roman emperor, but abandoned his faith and reverted back to the older paganism that preceded Christianity. But in his attempts to revive the pagan cults, the people didn't want to go along with it because they had all experienced the love of God who identifies with the poor in Christianity. So to try to remedy this, the emperor tried to implore the pagan priests to initiate activities in the service of the poor the way that the Christian priests did, but he was never able to reproduce the authentic enthusiasm that Christians had for that calling, because for the pagans, there was nothing inherent in their tradition, which was aimed primarily at the worship of strength and might to get them to want to care about the weak and the poor. But the same is true for the church. If you don't do everything you can to preserve and promote the faith of the church, Christians will stop caring about the poor too. And there's a crisis of faith going on in the church right now. Apostasy is the trend we've been suffering for multiple generations now. Former Catholics are the second largest denomination in the United States, if that was a denomination. But if you want to see communities where that kind of faith exists and where the kids growing up don't immediately abandon it the second they become adults, look at Latin Mass communities like the one where my family belongs. Look to homeschooling families where they get a traditional Catholic classical education rather than a progressive education designed to make them just economically useful idiots. And yet, these are the kinds of communities that are at best being ignored institutionally, or worse, being broken up and suppressed by the hierarchy. If you want a church that cares about the poor, you need to look at communities where they honor God through faith first, and then by that faith are able to find the motivation and encouragement to love others the way that God has loved them first. Without that, the church's priorities will be disordered, and she will continue to suffer the effects of that disorder. One of the ways that you can support justice in society is through pro-family beliefs and by avoiding brands that oppose them, because a lot of companies promote causes that erode what you might call the pillars of healthy society. So as customers of some of these companies, we can always reject large soulless corporate monopolies and focus instead on supporting small and especially Catholic businesses who instead build society up. One company that I'm familiar with that does that is Recusant Cellars. They're an authentically Catholic winery. And right now, they've let me know that they're having a sale in honor of Christ the King. So whether you enjoy a glass of wine yourself or you are looking for a classy way to spend time with family and friends, you should check them out. You can just go to recusantscellars.com. That's RECUSANT cellars.com. And you can use a promo code Christ the King for 20% off all their red wines now through October 26th. For my part, I'd say you won't regret buying from a small Catholic company.